I'm Linda, and this is No Frills ASMR. So, a couple weeks ago, maybe, I made a video looking at a book about guitars. I think it's called Stars Guitars. I can't remember. Anyway, and I think that's when I mentioned a Tennessee Ernie Ford song called 16 Tons. Maybe I couldn't think of the name. But I said it was about company stores and that maybe sometime I'd do a video about company stores. And in the comments recently of a video, somebody said, why don't you do that? So I said, okay. So I'm not a historian. I'm just making this video based on things I have read. I've either known from just being alive or have just read in the last hour to kind of learn a little bit about company stores, which also led into company towns. So I just thought we could talk a little bit about that just to kind of distract your mind maybe so you can relax and fall asleep or whatever. Or if you're like me, you kind of like to learn a little something while you're listening. So anyway, I printed up the lyrics to the Tennessee Ford song 16 Tons, which wasn't written by Tennessee Ford. It was actually written in 1947 by Merle Travis. And there are a lot of different recordings of it, but I had mentioned the Tennessee Ernie Ford. So, the lyrics are, some people say a man is made out of mud. A poor man's made out of muscle and blood. Muscle and blood and skin and bones. A mind that's a weak and a back that's a strong. By the way, I'll try to maybe put a link here to the song if you want to go listen to it real quick and come back. I'll wait. Okay, great. But this is the part that it says, you load 16 tons, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. And that's kind of what we're talking about. So apparently when you would start at a coal mine to kind of haze you in your first few days, they'd have you load 16 tons, and that's what that comes from. And Merle Travis, who wrote the song, his family had been miners. He wasn't, but apparently him and his songwriter that they were writing, the two of them were writing together, had said that what they do is almost as hard as loading 16 tons. And so they got the idea for this song from that. But then this part where it says, another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, and in case you don't know, St. Peter is the saint who is supposed to be at the gates of heaven. And when you die, you go, and St. Peter either says, come on in, or nope. St. Peter, don't you call me. So that means I can't die because I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. So that's what we're gonna, that little piece of my pen broke off. Talk a little bit about was the company store and what that is. Back in the, starting really, I think in the 1890s, or no, before that, probably 1880s, 70s. I don't know when it started, but the owners who had mines or and they wanted workers for their steel mills or their mines. I'm trying to think. There's other things. A lot of times they would be out, in the boonies, like in parts of that was far away from cities. And so you can't just say, hey, everybody come work for me, because nobody would have anywhere to live. So they would start company towns. And the original idea of a company town, you know, if you're a decent person, which I think some of the owners of these big businesses at first had good ideas. They were thinking of sort of a utopian area. So they'd have their, company here. And they would say, we'll build, you little houses that you can live in while you work for our company. And we'll pay you a real good, you can pay us rent, but it'll be not super expensive. And that'll be great. And we will build for you churches and schools for your kids to go to, and parks for them to play in. How do you draw a park? I don't know. And so this is going to be great. And I think for a lot of these company towns, at first it was pretty good because a lot of people were coming from places where they were living in tenement housing or just really, really poor conditions. So they'd move out to basically, a lot of times, way far away from other towns. And they would, live in these houses that weren't necessarily super nice, but they were a roof over your head kind of house. And maybe you'd pay $2 a month to live in the house or whatever. But you got the church and everything. And the schools for your kids, which would have been, pretty important because I don't think the public school system was set up the same as it is now. So that would have been a nice little perk. And I actually listened to I would recommend, actually, if you can find it, there's a PBS broadcast. It's online. And I just looked up, PBS company store or something like that. And there were these men who were kids who lived in the company town. They lived in one in Alabama. And it was interesting to hear them talk because the one man, he was a black man who lived in Alabama they lived in a company town for United States Steel, U.S. Steel. And his dad worked for the company. And he said it was a fully integrated town. So, white people and black people could live right next door to each other. But he said, to be honest, there were a lot more black people in that town than there were white people. And they weren't allowed to go to the same schools. So they would bus the white kids outside of town. And so he said, there was 3 baseball parks, baseball diamonds. And because the black kids played on them, they had to bus the white kids outside to play. So he's like, it was almost like the opposite of the rest of Alabama in that they were getting, the privilege really because there were so many more black kids. So that was kind of interesting. And he said the schools at that time were, U.S. Steel was based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but this was in Alabama. And for the school, they'd hire teachers in Pittsburgh and bus them into Alabama. And he said every year at the end of the year, they would test all the kids. And if they didn't do good enough on the testing, they fired the teacher and brought in a new one. So he's like, the schools were good, So it was interesting to hear him talk about the town at that time. And that is kind of the reality of these towns, that some of them were run pretty well and some of them were not. And I read about some towns where they kind of started off with this sort of, the word you keep seeing is utopian, which is sort of like this idea of, I don't know, what's the definition? Like the idea of a utopia, like everybody's going to work together and it's going to be this wonderful place. And so they had this utopian idea, but it was also what they call paternalism, which is like the boss. And we kind of talked about this with Henry Ford in the video I did about the big 3 automakers. That Ford in Dearborn, Michigan, had started putting houses in for his workers, and they were nice. And he also gave them a $5 a day workday, which was better than anywhere else. So everybody wanted to work for Ford's. But he also had, and I can't remember what it was called, but he had a group who would come around and make sure that you weren't drinking or gambling. And if you were, you're fired, you're out of the house. So that was sort of what they called like a paternalistic or daddy or father state kind of thing. And so that kind of thing would happen in these towns where they didn't want anybody going to the saloon or whatever. So those would have to be outside of town. They'd have bars and things like that outside of town. They weren't allowed in town. But then sometimes if they caught you going to those, you might lose your job. And they wanted everybody to go to the church because I think at the church they would have kind of specially hired preachers who would basically tell you if you don't work hard, you don't go to heaven. If you might have to suffer here on earth if you want to go to heaven. You know, that kind of thing, which keeps a person working. But what we're here to talk about is the company store. So you'd be paying rent, but then they also had the company store. And the company store would have everything you need. Your furniture, your tools, your groceries, meat, toys for your kids, supplies for your school, for your kids. All that stuff was at the company store. And the way it would work often is they would give you what's called a script or something like that. They call it something like that. And so you'd go into the store and any money you wouldn't have money. You'd just say like, okay, I want this pen. Well, that pen's 50 cents. Okay, put it on my tab. It's like a tab. So they'd say, okay, so now your next paycheck, you're going to owe 50 cents for the pen. So we all know from credit cards how this can work. So a lot of times people would end up in debt between the company store and their rent for their housing and other, maybe, I think even if you gave to your church, things like that would go into your debt. And you couldn't quit your job until you paid off the debt. So now you're sort of stuck. And one thing I read about the towns is some towns, they put barbed wire outside of the town to keep out scrupulous salespeople, is what they said, because they wanted a monopoly at the store. But not only did it keep out salespeople, but it also kept the people of the town in. So if you haven't paid and you decide, I'm just going to take off, they'd be like, no, you don't leave the town. So it really became, some of them, and by the way, every town was different, became almost like a work camp situation. And they stopped upkeeping the houses, things like that. Let me show you a picture that I found of a company store. The other thing with a company store, they would have only certain products. Now, sometimes it might be a product that the company has some kind of, they're making money off of. So there's no competition in products. Although there wasn't as much back then anyway, You'd have Heinz ketchup and that's it. That's the way it was. But there was no other market you could go to. This would be your only market. So if slowly the prices go up, you're still stuck paying those prices. So that's why they say in this song, I owe my soul to the company store. Because you can imagine if you bought your furniture there, if you bought your kids Christmas gifts there, this is, a lot of people didn't have cars back then. Well, I would say none of these people would have had cars. So they're really kind of stuck in this situation. So that's the company store. One thing about the when I was researching this, and I'm, like I said, not an expert on this, but I read about the Pullman Palace car, which they made train cars, but like fancy train cars. So they made the highest end train cars, and they were in the Chicago area, in a place. I think the guy who owned the company was called Pullman, and he named the company Pullman Palace Car, and named the town he built Pullman. So let's see real quick if we can see it on our map. All right, this is Kentucky, because we did that video on Kentucky the other day. But there were definitely these kind of towns in Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania. All right. So this town was south of Chicago. Hold on, let's look for they probably went up close. Yeah, here's sorry for all the noise. Here's an up close map of Chicago. They said it was 12 miles south of Chicago, near a lake. Huh, look at that, Pullman. And this lake. So this guy Pullman built this town in the 1890s. And if any of you have read the book Devil in the White City, it is about the World's Fair in Chicago in the 1893. It's a good book. I mean, it's got a murderer in it, if you're not interested in that part, but the historical part of it was really interesting. And I believe that was called like the Columbia Exposition or whatever they call it. I think that was over here somewhere, maybe right in here, because in the book they talk about how it was kind of like swampy land and they had to build it up. But Pullman would actually have people, first of all, if you could afford it, you'd get to ride in on a Pullman luxury train car. But then he'd ask people to come down to tour his city, because that's how nice Pullman was. And it was a company town. I'll show you this picture. So here is the shops, where they built the cars. And here's the lake and the administration building. Let's see. And see, he built this church. And all this was housing for her employees. And here's like the park. And I think maybe this was like water features, but I'm not sure. Maybe not. And there's the church. So it was like a real showpiece. Yeah, here we go. Okay. So here it shows public square. There's a hotel. Market house, so that's the company store probably. Playground, athletic course, lumberyard, school, and these are houses, I guess. But and here's a theater and a lake. So very fancy. But from my understanding, he did have people come to do tours of this place, but he actually had a lot of like squalor type houses outside of the city where a lot of the real workers lived. And these were more for, administrative workers or white collar type workers. So that was kind of interesting. But it was a situation where you couldn't live in the town or in the houses unless you worked for the company, which kind of makes sense. I mean, he's, paying for it. But you'd pay rent on your house to the company. Everything from the theater to the hotel. I don't know about the hotel, but the company store, everything went, to the company. And what happened apparently, in 1893, after the World's Fair, he cut wages. I don't know why. Probably wasn't making enough money, but he cut wages. And in the end, it ended up being like a 25% wage cut for the people who worked for his company. And he did not lower their rents at all. So they got together a committee and they went to him and said, we would like to request, because you have cut our wages, that you lower the rent. And they were flatly denied that. And the next week or so, every person who was on that committee was fired. And so the company workers decided to strike. So they went on strike, and it is, I think, my understanding is it's the first strike in U.S. history. And the United States government was like, this is terrible. We can't do this. People shouldn't be walking off their job and not working. We need, manufacturing to keep. So President Grover Cleveland, ordered federal troops in to crush the strike. And I mean, it turned ugly. Like, not great. Anyway, so after that, I think unions started to work together more. I don't have the rest of the story. But Pullman became really kind of a ghost town, I think, not a ghost town, but, it didn't stay around. But now my understanding is in Chicago, there's a historical building, and they're building it all back up, and it's pretty nice. In the pictures I saw, it looks like people live in the old houses, and it looks nice, like really nice. So I think it's nice now. So anyway, that's the story of Pullman Palace Car. So yeah, should we read some more lyrics? I don't know if there's anything else. I was born one morning when the sun didn't shine. I picked up my shovel and I walked to the mine. I loaded 16 tons of number 9 coal, and the straw boss said, well, bless my soul. A straw boss. I think a straw boss is a person who's given power. I'll give you an example. When I was a waitress at Red Lobster, they would not have enough managers. So they'd ask a server to be what was called a key employee. And they'd give you a key, which would let you into the cash drawer. And they basically told you can do everything a manager can do. And you get paid like a wage instead of the $2 an hour that waitresses and waiters get. And I was occasionally a key employee, even though I didn't really want to be. But there was one guy who was a key employee, and when he got that little bit of power, he would change. Like, he was such a jerk and would be like he'd boss everybody around. He was horrible. And I think that is a straw boss. A person who's given some power and kind of sometimes isn't great about it. Anyway, you load 16 tons. What do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. So he kind of goes on about having a hard life. But this part is kind of interesting. He says, if you see me coming, better step aside. A lot of men didn't, and a lot of men died. One fist of iron and one fist of steel. If the right one don't get you, the left one will. So I don't know if this is just from having his soul owed to the company store and having a rough life, that he's saying like he'll beat you up. But I have a feeling it might be a little deeper than that, and that it's kind of about like the fight I told you about at the end of this Pullman thing, where it's like, look, you can take advantage of me for so long, but now I'm stronger and I will fight back. So that's my guess on that part. I don't know. So anyway, there you go. A little bit about a company store. So basically, people just were working for the company, and the only place they could shop was at the company store. And all that money goes back to the company. So all the money from the rent and from the store and from their paychecks, it's all going back to this guy. And he's fat and having a good time. And then if they decide they want to lower wages, you still got to pay your rent and you still got to buy the company store. And if they raise the price of products, that's too bad. There wasn't much you could do about it back then. So a lot of people would be in debt. So the moral of my story is debt is a bad thing. Try to keep yourself out of debt. Don't buy stuff you don't need. Be careful with credit cards. That's rich guys' way of keeping you down.